Hello, this is David Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and this is the Jewish Contrarians podcast. I'm here with my usual partner in thought crime, Brandy Shafatinsky. Hi, Brandy.
Hi, David.
And we have a special guest who should be on up here with us. There she comes, Kara Jesella. Kara is a feminist scholar who wrote an amazing piece in Quillette magazine about the history of feminist anti-Semitism. I hope I got that right. And Kara and I have spoken before, and I thought she really did excellent work talking about how a certain variant of feminist ideology spawned a variant of anti-Semitism. And Kara, we're really pleased that you could join us, and really look forward to sort of talking about this and getting a sense of how this developed and where you're going with it as well. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, okay, so why don't we just cut to the chase here? Because I'm not going to give a rant about a subject you know way more than I do about. What is the thesis of your piece?
So my piece started with this simple question: how is it that feminism became so anti-Semitic? I mean, as we know, there have been so many Jews involved in feminism from the very beginning. So, Betty Friedan or Florence Howe, who was considered the mother of women's studies, Shulamith Firestone, who wrote The Dialectic of Sex. I mean, we could go on and on. And so how could this happen? And so what the piece does is it tracks changes in sort of feminist in-groups and their theories over a period of several decades. And so it thinks about, in the beginning, we think like Betty Friedan and the educated working woman. And then we think about the young radical feminists. And, they were saying things like the personal is political, sisterhood is powerful. And then we get to the 1980s, and the most important feminist theory of that time was being made within this lesbian feminist publishing scene. And so the identity then was the lesbian feminist woman of color. Then you get into the 2000s, and we see that there's another change. And there's an essay in 2005 that says, the ultimate feminist is really the female Palestinian suicide bomber. Of course, it sounds like I'm making that up, but this is a real thing. And then you get a little later, and we get to the trans anti-Zionist activist. So I'm sort of thinking about those changes and the theories that went along with those changes, and how we ended up where we are today, which we see feminists ripping down hostage posters and acting like rape is struggling by any means necessary.
I want to just connect the dots a little further. So I'm having trouble going from the young radical feminist to the Palestinian activist Hamas, archetype. What were the larger ideological currents that got them there?
So I think when going back, so in 1970, Robin Morgan publishes an anthology called Sisterhood is Powerful. She knew that, many of these feminists actually came out of the civil rights movement and the New Left. So they knew that race and class were very important. And in fact, their innovation was saying, well, actually, gender is important too. And, this idea, sisterhood is powerful, many women saw it as an overreach. They didn't want to be sisters. When Betty Friedan came out with her book, when she came out with The Feminine Mystique, she was also criticized. She was saying, women, you should get to work. And a lot of women said, well, if you go to work, I'm going to be the one taking care of your house, or I'm going to be taking care of your children. So there were many women, particularly poor women, women of color, who said, we don't really want to be sisters with you. Actually, you're oppressing us. And so that was sort of one of the first moves. Women of different races and ethnicities, they sort of joined together the late 70s, the 80s, and they made their own group, women of color. And these feminists were the ones who said, it's not just gender, it's race and class and other elements as well.
So is that when sort of the idea of intersectional feminism really started to set in? I mean, that what you're talking about is a period before the term intersectionality was actually even coined. But I've seen these memes on social media, and I've seen articles saying if your feminism isn't for, it doesn't counter fat phobia and racism and this, what's it even for? And it's sort of the case for intersectional feminism. Is that what it is, or is how you would describe it?
Absolutely. So the idea that of intersectionality, the term that Kimberly Crenshaw coins in 1989, Black feminists in particular had been working with this idea for years. So Kimberly Crenshaw brings it into the legal realm, but yes, in 1977, the Combahee River Collective, they have a Black feminist statement where they talk about identity politics. So this idea had been elaborated by many women, many feminists for decades.
Brandy?
I think that I don't know, there's a point there where I wonder if at what point is it watered down so much, whether it's through intersectionality or something else, that it's no longer feminism. And I mean, I noticed it with the Women's March and the people that were brought on to organize it and brought on to speak, and the values that they hold, or at least arguably, can be said to be anti-feminist. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, one of the things we've really seen change is this initial idea of intersectionality, where we're thinking about, all different components of someone's identity, how they would impact their lives and oppression. And now, Angela Davis says, well, now we think about it as intersectionality of struggles. So intersectionality was supposed to be about pointing out women's differences. Now it's really about covering up those differences and saying, American racism is the same as what's happening in Palestine, which is not true. And also, I think more to your point is this idea that women have kind of fallen out altogether. I mean, for feminists, I've been working on this project for a long time, so I knew about the extent of anti-Semitism in the feminist movement. But still, seeing how feminists have said that rape is okay, either pretend it's not happening, that Hamas didn't do it, or that it's a lie, or that it's not a big deal, that's really a whole new realm, I think. And I think to your point, I mean, I do not think that's feminism.
It's almost like, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I think about it as it's the same. I've worked for a long time, and for most of my professional career, working with victims and survivors of both domestic violence and sexual assault, and hearing the rhetoric that's coming out of these feminist groups. It's the same thing that anyone that's been an advocate has worked against. It's the what was she wearing,
Absolutely.
that he deserved it, that she pushed his buttons argument, which, I mean, for decades, advocates have worked in social justice spaces, have worked against those types of ideas because they're harmful to the movement for equality. And so hearing it from circles it's important, but it's important to me to the point of those aren't feminist groups anymore. They're standing directly counter to the rights of girls and women.
Right, exactly. And yet at the same time, we see, women's gender and sexuality studies departments not speaking up about this at all, and instead, putting things on their web pages that are exclusively about Palestine.
Yeah. It seems to me that what they've done is they've subsumed their feminism into a larger ideological framework. And so their primary loyalty is not to the idea of women in feminism, but to this larger ideology and explanatory framework for oppression and everything else. And so if it means, demeaning Israeli women who have been raped, well, that's what the larger cause requires us, because in the name of decolonization or whatever else.
Absolutely. I mean, there were always a lot of socialist feminists in the academy, so we now can see what that means. And in a way, I think an easy way to think about it is that Angela Davis's feminism won. And she was my professor in college. I was really interested in her work. And I don't think I took so seriously where some of it would go. I mean, she's always been very clear that, armed resistance is absolutely okay on the part of the oppressed. And she's always been quite clear on who is oppressed. She wrote an entire anti-Zionist tract in 2016. So I think this also does go back sort of a little bit to Betty Friedan, in that her feminism was sort of maligned from the beginning. And she was also seen very much as a Jewish woman. So, in the press, she was often characterized as shrewish or pushy. Sometimes they would not use her correct last name. They'd use another Jewish last name for her. So there's all kinds of anti-Semitism sort of surrounding her. And in 2021, in particular, there were all these books coming out about how white women are bad. So that the whole sort of Karen moment. And those books are often saying, they talk about the Karen and they talk about Betty Friedan. And this woman is clearly a Jewish woman. So I think hanging over feminism sort of from the beginning has been this idea of the Jewish woman as bad. And that sort of played into where we are now.
Mm. Yesterday I was speaking to a woman rabbi who was telling me that she was a women's studies major undergrad. And she said to me, sort of offhandedly, I wonder if my department at my university is even still called women's studies. So while we're talking, I jump online, I Google it. I said, it's actually women's gender and sexuality studies, which is exactly what you just called the field.
Mm-hmm.
When did that shift actually take place in terminology?
So I would say it probably started around 1990. I think that's 1990 is when Judith Butler's Gender Trouble is published, and it is a groundbreaking book. It says that biological sex and gender expression are not necessarily aligned. And this moment sort of changes everything. Lesbians at the time, many lesbians said, I want to be a lesbian feminist, but sort of everything sort of becomes queer. And so this is a moment when feminists are becoming less separatist. So they're working with more men. And I think that was really the moment. There's a quote from a women's studies professor, Nancy K. Miller, and she says, it's become a positive embarrassment to talk about women. So this has been sort of percolating for a while, but I think it is part of a larger trajectory of, that's sort of a moment where we don't care as much about women, and then it sort of gets to a moment where we are now, where women might actually often be the enemy.
I want to ask you something. I go back to my days in undergraduate and graduate school. Like, this is late 1980s, early 1990s, and so forth. And my impression of the women's studies at that time was that look, there's no doubt that feminism itself was transformative and an incredibly important movement in American society. But by that time, I already felt that it was sort of it was closed intellectually. Like, I write about this in my book. I took a women's studies class, and the professor said in no uncertain terms that I wasn't, my voice wasn't welcomed or whatever. It was already so linked to identity. It already felt very politically activist to me then. And it was my first sort of brush up against what I would call radical social justice ideology today. It felt like it was a fully developed set of ideas, and that it was not to be questioned, and that and it was based on lived experience, which gave one validity in the conversation and also prevented others from having voice. What is your experience on that? Is there a liberal feminism out there? And if so, who's talking about it?
So there was a liberal feminism. It was not in the academy. And so I agree with you. There were always all kinds of rules. And especially, in the 1980s, you see, and this is a time when all these women are really trying to work out these rules. And so there's ideas like confrontation, and especially confronting white women, is seen as an act of love. That the idea that anger is powerful and creative. So there's a lot about so there's a lot of women getting angry at each other. And I think you're absolutely right. There were ideas about, and almost all of the literature says this. It says, we should center women of color. The idea was sort of that white women, which Jews were always considered a part of, that they needed to step back, that they were not as radical. So I think you're absolutely right, but liberal feminism was laughed at a little bit. It was sort of considered, the Women's March, when the Women's March took place, I don't remember that anybody in the academy really caring or talking about it. So it was this huge thing that was happening out in the world. Lots of moms that I knew were going, but it wasn't a thing that was being talked about among young feminists.
Really? Because it wasn't sufficiently radical? They didn't see themselves as being part of that movement for women, rather they were part of a larger ideological struggle? Why is that?
I think it is because it wasn't seen as radical. I think in general, one of the big things about liberal feminism is that it's about trying to make women equal to men, and trying to sort of fit into some of the existing structures. And in the academy, it's really about, it's overthrowing the whole thing. So, and it really is. I mean, I think we know this now with what's been going on in the world, but, no America, like the West is bad, no imperialism. So a lot of feminists in the academy would say voting isn't important, rationality isn't important. So it's about it's about a different world, it's about a different value set. You said something else that I wanted to just bring out because I think it was important. I think part of the problem that got us to where we are is that early feminist theory was really good. Like, it was very successful, right? I mean, women are doing all kinds of things now. All different kinds of feminists participated in creating a world where women can do all kinds of things that they couldn't do before and express gender in all kinds of ways they couldn't express before. And I think, it's the academy, you're creating theory. And a lot of the theory, I think, was very good and had maybe already been created. So it starts going to these sort of new, wild places, which is really fun. I love reading it. I enjoyed writing it when I was in graduate school. But I think that, it's no longer in a place where it's actually useful to or sympathetic to women.
Mm.
I think we actually have seen that before internationally, if we think about women's rights in Afghanistan and how few mainstream feminist organizations have been vocal about that. I think we've seen it more recently with the women's rights movement in Iran, where once again, very few women's organizations and leadership speak out in support of women in Iran who are risking their lives, some losing their lives, for equality. But they're also not looking to they're looking to overthrow a system like the Taliban or the Iranian regime, but they're not looking to overthrow a system of Western equality. They're looking to participate in it.
Right, exactly. So I think I think a lot of women, a lot of feminists are worried about being seen as imperialist if they do support those women. And I think you're exactly right that they don't want more countries to be participating in what we sort of think of as a Western way of life.
Can we take a step back for a second? I want a refresher. Can you sort of describe first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave feminism? And so, in the most basic terms possible, so I can sort of, next time I'm in a conversation with someone, I can actually label, like I have a sense of what first wave is. I have a sense of what second wave is. I think I know what third wave is. I'm not sure how I could easily contrast third and fourth wave. So help us out there.
Sure. So first wave is the suffragettes. And we think of that as very white feminist. Second wave is like the baby boomers. And so when we talk about feminism, when we're thinking about modern feminism, that's what we're talking about. So we're talking about Betty Friedan with the feminine mystique kicking it off in 1963.
What does it want? What does she want? She wants more equality in the workplace, more equality in relationships, right?
She wants both of those things. And yes, so the radical feminists, sort of the younger group, actually, you know what? I would say, yes, that is what they want. And in fact, a lot of times we make distinctions between the liberal groups and the radicals. They actually kind of wanted the same things. They were just going about it in different ways. And then when we get to third wave, so I technically would be considered third wave. I think of it as more like 90s feminism. That was sort of a moment where third wave feminists were a little bit embarrassed of their moms, and they wanted, it's a little bit more of a fun feminism. I think there's sort of a return to thinking about things like femininity. And this is sort of also a moment where we're really thinking about sexuality and queerness. And, you know, is queer just about sexuality? Is it also just about being deviant in general? There's a lot of queer theory that talks about, Heather Love, who's a queer theorist, talks about the injunction to be deviant. So this is sort of what's third wave. When you're thinking about third wave feminism, a lot of times you'll think about pop culture, pop music.
Lilith Fair.
Lilith Fair, exactly. Third wave feminism is Lilith Fair. Whether or not there is a fourth wave, I think is something that's been discussed. If there were, maybe we would say it's internet feminism. But there's also been all kinds of pushback on whether we should periodize feminism in this way at all. And it is kind of interesting for me as Gen X, as a third wave feminist. It's been interesting to see the ways in which feminists that are younger than me are also kind of in some ways like feminists who are older than me in their sort of in their socialism, and also just in the way that they approach politics. I think that we are a little bit more of a laid back feminist generation.
So you described the sort of onset of Judith Butler and her gender theory, and I'm wondering, you know, look, there's clearly a lot of tensions, and I'd love to get a sense of that, because it clearly also plays out in the politics of anti-Semitism as well, between sort of what are called TERFs, and how prominent is the trans exclusionary radical feminist in today's feminist movement? Are they complete outliers? Is it a small group, or is that really a force? Like, if you were going through university women's gender and sexuality studies, do they occupy a prominent place at universities, or are they just people that we hear about on Twitter who are hated by the, you know, fourth wavers?
I do not think that you could be an academic feminist and be a TERF. And I think, or to say it in a nicer way, just to criticize the way that gender is currently theorized in the academy. And I do actually think that this has been a problem. I mean, I as I said, I loved queer theory. I think thinking about gender is one of the things that feminism has done in such interesting ways. But to say, okay, we're done, we figured it out, and you're no longer allowed to question it. I mean, that to me, you know, women's studies, gender and sexuality studies, it was always about transforming not just the academy, but the world. But to me, there have always been some feminists who said, no, it's still a discipline. It should still be intellectual. We should still be able to ask questions. So I think we have gone much too far with saying that you have to agree with this new orthodoxy around gender.
There are people like Camille Paglia and others who, you know, take a sort of evolutionary psychology perspective. They argue that gender is not entirely socially constructed. It is also dictated by the way that men and women have evolved in their physical environments over thousands of years. And that women and men are, on average, inherently different from each other. What is, first of all, I'm curious to get your own view on that, given that you're a third waver, and that's but also where you think the field is there room for that within that discourse?
I don't even know exactly what I think, but I do think that they've made it so that there is no room for that, and I don't think that's great. And I do think, you know, something that one of you said before, it sort of seems now like I mean, is gender studies really different from American studies, different from, it sort of seems like everything's sort of like a critical
Mush.
social justice. Yeah. So, I mean, maybe if schools want to have that and it can be its one department that does that. But I think having this department where you're really not even allowed to ask these questions and you're just learning these theories as though they're true. I mean, going back to anti-Semitism for a moment, I think a lot of times students, you know, they come to women's studies, they probably don't know a lot about Jewish history. They're immediately confronted with these articles that are talking about, you know, how terrible Israel is, or how Jews are white. And that's sort of the end of it, and that's really all they're learning, and they're not supposed to question it. So I think that's where I am with these. You know, I have an 8-year-old, so I'm still hoping that some of this can change before I get her to college.
Yeah, I remember. Go ahead, Randy.
Sorry, David. It seems like a disconnect between theory and application. So there are all of these theories, and these are, you know, held very rigidly in the academy. But then when they are applied to the real world, they fall apart. So I don't know if that's fueling the desire to, you know, don't question, don't delve deep, don't research, don't look into it. But when these theories, critical social justice, radical social justice theories, are applied to the real world, so when they're applied to what Hamas did on October 7th and since, when they're applied to the women's movement in Iran, to the Kurdish women who are fighting across Iraq and other places, they don't really fit. And I just wonder what that means when we're producing a lot of theories, but they're not applicable to the real world, what that's going to end up looking like.
Right, exactly. I think that makes perfect sense. You know, the place where these theories are working, they sort of become DEI or something like that. You know, there's like certain jobs where these theories get to continue to live, whether or not they are continuing to make sense in our lives.
I want to ask you about your personal evolution. I mean, here you are, I'm guessing an outlier. Maybe you've even further, you know, pigeonholed yourself in this, you know, intellectual environment we're in. How did you get to write a piece in Quillette and be on our podcast? Like what personal changes, what happened to you?
Well, lucky me, I was older when I went back to get my PhD. I had been a feminist journalist and I had written a book. So I always wasn't really sure I was going to stay in the academy. And I desperately wanted to be doing more theoretical work, and I loved being in graduate school. But I was also lucky enough that I had my first women's studies professor in college was a rabbi. And so I learned all about this Jewish feminism that we don't have anymore, but that, you know, would say very nuanced things about Israel. So to me, I always felt like that was a part of feminism. And it really wasn't until the last few years where I could see that that was no longer true. And so as I was finishing up my PhD and as I was defending my dissertation, that was happening right at the moment when Hamas and Israel were fighting in 2021. And so a week after I graduated, I made myself my bibliography and I said, like, this is the next project that I'm going to do. And I think you're right. I probably think I'm a way outlier at this point.
Would you get a job in the academy if you tried?
Absolutely not. I can't imagine I would. And it's been sad watching, you know, I didn't unfollow everyone. I still see some of what my friends or people who were my friends are posting on Instagram, and they're at top schools, you know, flying the Palestinian flag on October 7th, the day that this happened. So no, I think I'm an outlier.
And is there a way, you know, I'm asking a larger question here. I guess we'll end on this because it's something we think a lot about. Do you think there's a way to get sort of the structural reform? I mean, can you imagine a university women's studies department reforming itself to become more liberal, to become more open, to become less ideologically charged? Where do we go from here, I guess is what I'm asking.
I have trouble imagining it with the university. I do think feminism can save itself. Feminism is a lot of people and it's decentralized. So I do think there's hope.
But do the people who are out there in the workforce who and mothers who want different arrangements with their either husbands or wives, or is that sort of realist feminist? Does it speak in the name of feminism though? Is it, or is it just people wanting their lives to be better, women wanting their lives to be better? I mean, are they articulating an ideology that's competitive in the marketplace of ideas?
I think yes. I think that liberal feminism still. I mean, yes. I think that those are real ideas, and feminism does come out of people's personal issues. Yes. So I think that it could be, but I really don't know where women's studies, gender and sexuality studies. I don't know where that's going to go, because those ideas are so far out of the mainstream at this junction, and I don't see anybody really trying to bring them back.
Yeah, well, this has been fascinating, and it's an area where I felt like I needed some education myself, and I'm really glad we were able to bring you to our listeners. And I'd like to continue the conversation. You could and talk to you more. And Brandy, do you have any final thoughts?
No, just thank you for coming, speaking with us.
Thank you both.
Yeah. Well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
Take care.